welcome to another episode of Captive Minds. The song for the montage was Pithecanthropus erectus by Charles Mingus. My name is Shayna Batterson, and I'll be your host today. I am a writer and have a Substack page called The Red Letter. With me is my co-host, Max Perry. Hi, Max.
Hello, Shayna and everyone.
Max is an independent journalist whose work is currently syndicated with Covert Action magazine. Today's topic is actually related to an article that I recently, with Max's help, had published in CAM called Solzhenitsyn and the Weaponization of Dissidents. We're going to discuss how the CIA meddled and manipulated literature during the Cold War. Many of what are considered the great novels of the 20th century were promoted as anti-communist propaganda. And also, this as an aside, I think that fictional stories in novels, they begin to have a power, and people then tend to project them onto reality, as we see with people constantly making references to 1984, and we'll get to George Orwell later. But let me just read an excerpt from my essay to start. Quote, "The U.S. targeted the USSR with more than just radio waves. In a National Security Council document from December 9th, 1969, it was admitted that the CIA sponsored a covert action program against the USSR, which supported media and contact activities, which pushed for liberalization within the Soviet Union. The CIA had a book publishing and distribution program through the American Committee for Liberation from Bolshevism, AMCOMLIB, which was designed to provide Soviet citizens with dissident literature. The non-radio programs of Free Europe Incorporated and Radio Liberty Committee Incorporated also sponsored book distribution across the Soviet Union. There was even a program to distribute anti-Soviet propaganda literature throughout the Third World. Actually, that a lot of the information around that is still classified. But anyhow, Free Europe Incorporated administered a program for exiles who fled Eastern Europe post-World War II, even though many of these exiles would have been Nazi collaborators. Free Europe Inc.
Surprise, surprise.
Free Europe Inc. and Radio Liberty Committee Inc. distributed a total of 2.5 million books across the USSR and Eastern Europe between the late 50s and the late 60s alone. So as you can see, this was no small project. So this is interesting to me because it sort of disproves, when people say that like art transcends politics, it very much shows how art and literature can become a weapon of politics. From a declassified document stating the objectives of AMCOMLIB, the mission of the organization was this, quote, "To conduct overt anti-Soviet activities designed to weaken the prestige and power of the Soviet dictatorship, primarily within the USSR, and thereby to reduce its threat to world security with such cooperation as is obtainable for moderate elements in the emigration from the USSR who are willing to work together in this task. To this end, as well as in preparation for possible crises preceding and following the downfall of the Soviet regime, the latent and existing forces of the Soviet emigration will be developed and encouraged to become constructive, cohesive, and friendly to the United States rather than disruptive and divisive." So basically, the people that left the Soviet Union, they were sort of being trained and encouraged and then sent back to bring their pro-United States ideas.
No, I think I mean, war, is traditionally fought with bombs and with, literal weapons and guns and all that. But I think during all war, there's propaganda war. But I think in the Cold War, especially, there was there was an expansion of the whole nature of propaganda where things like, yes, literature was weaponized, especially when the Cold War itself was so much, the basis of it was, you know, the world wars were imperialist wars over, colonial territories and there were inter-imperial rivalries and whatnot. I mean, Second World War, it's more complicated because the USSR became an ally with the Western powers and whatnot. But basically, those were, especially World War I, those were uh, imperialist wars. But the Cold War was fundamentally, the basis of it was ideological. It was a disagreement over how to govern, how to organize society, and also the fact that after World War II ended, the US and the USSR emerged as the two world powers, and they were at odds ideologically, and especially since what drives Western imperialism is access to resources, and the Soviet Union was aligned with the developing world, the global South, that wanted independence and decolonization. And they were always, I mean, the bombs were dropped on Japan fundamentally to send a signal to the Soviet Union that the US was the preeminent superpower, and that kickstarted the arms race because suddenly the Soviets had to acquire the same technology. But I think what you're talking about, fundamentally it was a war of ideas, and that's when the West began to look to the cultural sphere as a really important element of its propaganda campaign in competing with the Soviets. And literature, like many other mediums, was one of the primary places where they did that.
Yes, those are good points. And I think it's kind of funny and interesting, people will complain that there's not literature today like there used to be, but in this time that's sort of held up as being this era when there's a lot of good literature. Well, you know, a lot it was because it was getting like these artists were actually getting government funding from the CIA, but you know, because having the money coming to promote the culture makes there be more
Mm.
culture. But anyhow, back to what I was saying about AMCOMLIB, it, too, like with Solzhenitsyn, who when he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature, the CIA was kind of excited and in declassified documents, they noted how the decision was a problem for the Soviet leadership. And actually, I can't find direct connections between Solzhenitsyn and the CIA, but the CIA was in other declassified documents. They were eagerly awaiting his upcoming, at that time, novel, August 1914, and his works were definitely, I mean,
There didn't
very
even need to be a direct connection. I mean, they lent themselves so easily.
exactly. And AMCOMLIB, which by its own admission had as just a few of its operational objectives, the stoking of political tensions and strife within the Soviet leadership. This was another thing. This is a bit off the topic, but I it's not very well known, I don't think. But Operation Splinter Factor. Operation Splinter Factor was an initiative spearheaded by the loathsome and notorious Allen Dulles, the great spy master of the 20th century and Nazi. He worked with a lot of former Nazis, which the operation was aimed at, well, like it sounds, at Splinter Factor, splintering, aimed at creating paranoia within the communist parties that govern the Eastern Bloc countries and sort of causing strife and so Joseph Swiatlo, who is a double agent working for Dulles, he integrated himself into the Polish security services. He then fed lies about subversion, infiltration, and traitorousness within the Communist Party to Moscow so as to demonize and purge the more moderate, nationalistically minded communists, which the West feared because then it would make communism look good. And they basically, Operation Splinter Factor wanted to make communism look as bad as possible and cause infighting and sort of try to implode it from the inside. Swatlow painted Noel Field, who was a communist who had briefly worked with Dulles during World War II to help refugees from Nazi Germany as an American spy. So then anyone that had connections with Field was arrested when it was really Swiatlo who was the spy. This was written about in William Blum's book Killing Hope, which is a history of CIA interventions. Let me just read a few excerpts to.
Here, got it.
Yep, that's the book. Um, Quote, more importantly, Dulles saw that Swiatlo, using Noel Field, the American spy, as a bludgeon could knock off countless leading communist officials in the Soviet bloc. It could put the whole of the bloc into a state of acute paranoia and set off a wave of repression and Stalinist tyranny that could eventually lead to uprisings. Dulles called his plan Operation Splinter Factor. Thus it was that Joseph Swiatlo was directed to find spies everywhere in Eastern Europe, who would uncover American plots and British plots, Trotskyist conspiracies and Titoist conspiracies. He'd report to Soviet secret police chief Lavrenti Beria himself that at that at the center of the vast network was a man named Noel Field. Field was arrested and wound up in a prison in Hungary, as did his wife Herta when she came looking for him. And when his brother Herman Field sought to track down the two of them, he met the same fate in Poland. Many of the victims throughout those purges were people who had spent the war years in the West rather than in the Soviet Union, and thus had crossed Field's path. There were people who tended to be more nationalist communists who wanted to put greater distance between their countries in the Soviet Union, as Tito had done in Yugoslavia, and who favored a more liberal regime at home. Dulles brushed aside the argument that these people are to be supported, not eliminated. He felt that they are potentially more dangerous to the West because if their form of communism were allowed to gain foothold in Eastern Europe, then communism might become respectable and accepted, particularly with Italy and France threatening to vote communists into power. Communism had to be shown at its worst. After Svetlo defected in December 1953, East European intelligence services came to realize that he had been working for the other side all along. 4 weeks after Svetlo held his Washington press conference, the Polish government announced that it was releasing Herman Field because investigation had revealed that the charges which had been brought against him by an American agent and provocateur, Joseph Swiatlo, were baseless. Field was later paid $50,000 for his imprisonment, as well as having his convalescence at a sanatorium paid for. Close quote. And that's why I think I've seen on the internet the meme about the whole all the infighting on the left is because of the CIA, and I mean, if you look at this, it's not totally baseless, but the other arrested fields were released as well, plus many others Swetlo had directed suspicion towards. So sorry, that was a bit of a side tangent. Go ahead.
No, I think it's really, I mean, I actually was not really aware of this operation. I think it's actually kind of makes you think back in hindsight, at least. I mean, I know that, I mean, obviously the CIA was created in what, 1947? So it wouldn't have been around when, for example, like the purges of the Stalin era occurred in the 1930s, in the Soviet Union, where, you know, I think even the most ardent Marxist-Leninists would admit that a lot of innocent people were probably caught up on that, though I do think that it's also been proven that there was, a fifth column going on and that there was some basis to the paranoia. I mean, apart from the fact that the country was invaded by collectively by 13 countries, and that there was good reason to be suspicious of sabotage and internal strife, and
In this,
there was the Trotskyist movement. But I guess my point is that in hindsight, it makes you wonder about how much of the paranoia and the political purges that went on within the Soviet Union was that whipped up. I mean, I guess back then it would have been MI6 that was doing that. I don't know. I mean, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was the hand of Western intelligence agencies, if that's what they did subsequently in behind the Iron Curtain, during the Cold War, in Eastern Europe, fomenting, paranoia and creating an environment where there's widespread distrust and the authorities are maybe cracking down on people who aren't even necessarily really doing any plotting against the state or whatever. Like, it makes you wonder about the past, the Stalin era, for example.
Yeah, I agree. I thought that too, and I read that, and it really does make you wonder. And I know in the same book, Blum talked about too how apparently in East Germany the CIA had basically like sponsored people to sabotage and like wreck industry, poison milk from cows, and do all sorts of other crazy stuff. So it's like I wouldn't be surprised. And I was just thinking the other day, it's people always associate, or the common association is with like the Bolshevik Revolution and then famines. But at the time, the country, Russia, was invaded by all these other countries and then was, like, by the US, denied food aid.
Yeah, well, that's always the case. I mean, with Iraq, famously, and the sanctions always create famine. I mean, something like 500,000 kids in Iraq died during the 90s under Saddam because it was a sanctions preventing everything from baby food to, formula to life-saving medicine. I mean, that's what these sanctions do. I mean, the same thing with North Korea. I mean, it's always what they do. And as far as the famines in the Soviet Union go, that's something that was disseminated in propaganda rags owned by William Randolph Hearst, who was a Nazi sympathizer, and also, by the Ukrainian diaspora that has created this whole propaganda myth of the Holodomor being this intentional famine. And of course, there was a famine, but the famine was Soviet wide. It was just as bad, if not worse, in places like Kazakhstan. It was, and also the Russian Empire had historically had famines like routinely. I mean, you want to look at an intentional famines, look at like the Bengali famine, the British, the Irish potato famine. I mean, there's endless examples. There's a famine going on in Gaza right now, for God's sake, and in Yemen as well. I mean, this is what Western sanctions do. I mean, was there mismanagement? Was there was the forced collectivization, did it go exactly smoothly? Obviously not. But the idea that the state was trying to intentionally starve its own population, there's absolutely no credible evidence or basis to that whatsoever, and it flies in the face of any serious analysis.
Yes, exactly. And I was just listening to something about that, how it was actually, even though it's, the Holodomor, which is a Ukrainian word, it's actually worse in Kazakhstan. You don't hear anyone talking about that.
Yeah, and
It
it's funny.
wasn't just this isolated famine while everyone else is like, oh, there's no famine.
Yeah, well, and it's also that like Stalin had something against Ukrainians or something. I mean, it's ridiculous, and it's so funny. I mean, I live here in the DMV area, and in DC, it's I regularly pass by the Holodomor. I've told people this on social media, like the Holodomor. I mean, it's a big propaganda stunt. It's like they right down the block from the Victims of Communism Memorial statue. They have a big relief sculpture recognizing the Holodomor. Um, and very frequently, there are homeless Americans sleeping on it or around it. But it also has anti-homeless spikes on it, like anti-homeless studs. So people can't lay out comfortably, though it hasn't prevented some homeless people I've seen. More power to them. I mean, it's just the irony is, and right across the street from the Victims of Communism Memorial, up until recently, there was a big like tent city, like homeless encampment. So it's just like while the West is propagandizing about famines under communism and all this, it's got real social ills and actually starting people on the streets right next to these monuments. It's just so ironic. So yeah.
Okay, that was, we kind of went on an accidental tangent, but
Yeah,
that's
sorry.
okay. No, it was good. To get back to the CIA and literature, um, Max, do you think you could talk a bit about the Congress for Cultural Freedom? Because that's kind of
Yeah, I
central to
mean,
this whole thing.
yeah, it is. I mean, I think that there's a distinction that has to be made between the West's weaponization of texts like that came out of the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe, like in the case of like Arthur Koestler or Boris Pasternak or even like Solzhenitsyn and stuff like that. But it is sort of related. That was stuff that was going on in, trying to sabotage the Soviet Union, but there was also propaganda aimed at the Western left in an attempt to diminish its sympathies with the Soviet Union and international solidarity because, during the Second World War, there was the Popular Front, where, as I mentioned, Soviet Union and the US were aligned for a period. So after the war was over, there was this predicament for the West, which had now marked the Soviet Union as an enemy. There was still carryover, as far as like the left, like in this country, for example, the Communist Party had been instrumental in Roosevelt's political success, at least in the latter half of his administrations. With the New Deal and all that. But we've talked about the Congress for Cultural Freedom on this podcast before, but just to give it some context, like after the World War II was over, at the outset of the Cold War, there was there was still a lot of sympathy with the communist bloc, and the West, I think, realized that it had to, McCarthyism was also starting around this same time, where out in the open, people were being persecuted for allegedly harboring communist sympathies. But I think that at a certain point, the CIA and the Western, elite, they realized that that wasn't going to be enough. They had to do some stuff behind the scenes, in order to make what people like Gabriel Rockhill calls a compatible left, or Frances Stoner Saunders in her book, The Cultural Cold War, she calls the non-communist left, whatever you want to call it. And we've talked about the Congress for Cultural Freedom before on this podcast, but I guess I'll do just a little recapping for those who aren't aware. Basically, at the outset of the Cold War in 1949, there was an organization that was formed, the CCF, that was in response to this, situation that I was describing, that because of World War II and the temporary alliance between the Western powers and the Soviets during the wartime, there was still amongst the cultural intelligentsia and intellectual milieu of the period, across culture generally, there was still a lot of sympathy with the Soviet Union, so they needed to counter that, and they were very afraid because there were these, like in 1949, there was a conference put on at the Waldorf Astoria, called the Cultural and Scientific Conference for World Peace. It featured composers like Dmitri Shostakovich and Leonard Bernstein, who were each, delegates representing the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And this was sort of the last gasp of the Popular Front during after World War II. And actually, Aaron Copland was another composer who was there at this conference. Although he'd never been a member of the Communist Party, he was associated with a number of left-wing causes and was targeted during the Red Scare. And this conference was one of several that the CIA identified as a source of concern. It became later, these conferences later turned into what became the World Peace Council, which was this Soviet-sponsored campaign for nuclear disarmament and peace. They wanted a nuclear weapon-free world. And there were a number of people at these conferences. There was one in Paris, chaired by W.E.B. Du Bois. People like Picasso participated and even designed the logo, which I've got tattooed here, by the way. But there are a number of people They were part of the artistic and intellectual, strata, and were very high profile. And the CIA realized that this peace effort, this Henry Wallace also in 1948, he had run on the Progressive Party ticket, promoting peace and cooperation with the Soviet Union. There was still a left that was there was still semblances of the Popular Front left after the war was over. And they went after people, people like W.E.B. Du Bois. He was charged under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, been to travel for years. And I was looking at the CIA documents talking about these conferences and how they were perceived as a threat. And they brought together people from various fields in the name of world peace. And I think that the CIA realized it had a real problem. Also, you have to consider that the US government and the CIA realized that in order to maintain this image of freedom and democracy, it could not intervene and look overt. It could not, they already had McCarthyism going on, which was publicly persecuting people, but it had to do something behind the scenes. It could not control and manipulate the arts in an overt way, because the whole thing was that it was supposed to be, we have freedom of expression here. Over there, is where they censor and refuse to publish stuff because it doesn't align with the ideology of the state. So they had to do something covertly behind the scenes to manipulate arts and culture and, the left, really. And that's what the Congress for Cultural Freedom was. And they did this through the clandestine funding of various cultural activities. The money was funneled through phony foundations that they set up as a front for their operations and their secret financing. So in a way, they were controlling what was going on, but they were doing it in a confidential way, in a cloak and dagger way. And this included people. It blows their mind when they read about this. But if you read Francis Stoner Saunders' book, which is really great, I recommend everybody reads it. They funded everything from art exhibitions and art festivals. Particularly, they were interested in promoting the work of artists associated with abstract expressionism, and this art critic named Clement Greenberg. They also, organized and staged international conferences to counter the ones that the World Peace Council was putting on. They had a news service, and they also, to get to literature, they had several literary magazines and funded several scholarly periodical journals. In some cases, they appropriated already existing publications, like the Partisan Review was one that had started initially as a publication associated with the Communist Party USA, which had this thing called the John Reed Club of New York, which was, of course, named after the journalist John Reed, who wrote 10 Days That Shook the World. But then at a certain point, it got taken over by a group of very hawkish ex-Marxists or ex-Trotskyists. Basically, what happened was, during the Popular Front, the CPUSA had started, I guess, another association called the League of American Writers, and that left the John Reed Club of New York to basically dissolve. And so there was the Partisan Review, meanwhile, I guess, sat dormant for a short period, and then it was taken over by this group of very hawkish ex-Trotskyists and was relaunched.
Trotskyists again.
Yeah, always. And basically, it was relaunched and became a more social democratic and very staunchly anti-communist and anti-Stalinist publication. And not coincidentally, that's also when it began to receive a lot of covert CIA funding. And it was just one of several journals where the selection of those who were curated as featured writers, they were of a left-wing perspective, but with the additional caveat or stipulation that they were also very anti-communist. And this was one of the main ways they went about trying to create this non-communist left or compatible left. And so, like I said, some of them they took over existing publications like the Partisan Review, but they also launched in new publications like Encounter magazine, which was headed by the ex-Trotskyist turned neoconservative Irving Kristol. He launched Encounter. If you don't know, his son is also William Kristol, who's like the big neoconservative ideologue, one of those who was behind the Bush administration's foreign policy doctrine. And also there was other publications like Dermo Not, several others. I mean, they had a whole array of journals.
Yeah, the CIA also had connections to Paris Review.
Yes.
The co-founder was actually a CIA agent. And also the magazine Mundo Nuevo, which had a moderate left perspective aimed at getting the trust of Latin American readers, which it drew attention away from the more radical perspectives of the Cuban Revolution. But that was interesting what you were saying about the World Peace Congress, because if you actually, read the history, it's contrary to what propaganda has said. It's very obvious that the Soviet Union kept calling for peace and disarmament, and it was the US that was like, we want war, we want war, we want war.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. Like, I mean, because people will say, okay, well, what the US was doing was counter to was just to counter what the Soviets were doing. It's like, yes, the Soviets were sponsoring cultural endeavors as well. But look what they were promoting. They were promoting they were promoting peace and cooperation. I mean, oh my God, so nefarious. Um, I mean, yeah, the CIA launched this stuff. There was of course, an ideological battle. Yes, it went two ways, but I mean, it played out in a number of ways. I mean, all this stuff came out much late. I mean, the Congress for Cultural Freedom was not divulged until the 1960s. Actually, there was a series of articles. It came out in the New York Times of all places, where there was like all these various phony foundations like the Kaplan Fund and all these other phony fronts that they had that came out, that they had done this stuff. And then also Ramparts magazine divulged that they had covertly funded the National Student Association, because the Soviets also had international student conferences and delegations, and they were winning over people, and the CIA realized they had to covertly manipulate that stuff as well. So they would set up rival organizations. They sent people to go in and infiltrate these. The Soviets had the World Festival and Youth and Students. It actually still exists. It's under the Russian Federation. It's not Marxist or communist themed, but it does promote international diplomacy and cooperation. It's still around. I think it's under a slightly different name, but it still exists. And actually, it's interesting. The one of the phony groups that the CIA sent into these student conferences was run by Gloria Steinem, who later became of course, iconic feminist and new left figure. So, but to get to literature, I mean,
Sorry, I just wanted to add something about Encounter, because you mentioned Encounter.
mhm.
Um, so I learned recently that Orwell's publisher since 1938, Frederick Warburg, who also worked for the IRD, because Orwell worked for a time for a brief time. He made snitch lists for the IRD, which was a covert branch of the British government, called, the Information Research Department. But anyhow, his publisher, Frederick Warburg, also worked for the IRD. And interestingly, he actually became a member of the Society for Cultural Freedom, which is what ended up producing the CIA-funded magazine Encounter, which I didn't know any of this, but
Well,
that was
I
just
know Franz Borkenau who was affiliated with Orwell and the IRD, he was also, I believe, with the Congress for Cultural Freedom. So there's a lot of overlap here. I mean, like Bertrand Russell was with the CCF and the IRD. So there's a lot of,
Yeah, sorry, that was just go ahead. That was just my tangent.
well, yeah, yeah. I mean, it was founded. The CCF was founded by these people funding these literary magazines. Like I said, Irving Kristol was a neoconservative, and also Sidney Hook, another ex-Marxist who became a neocon, like the historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who was in the Kennedy administration later on. But also, there were some prominent literary figures that were associated. Like one of whom was Arthur Koestler, and he was a Hungarian writer who'd been a communist early in his life and later became disillusioned, with Stalinism. And he's most famous for having written the book Darkness at Noon, which is a very famous book. It's about, I mean, I tried to read it years ago. I couldn't get through it, but it's about an old Bolshevik basically who's arrested, imprisoned, and tried for treason. There's a dictator in it that's referred to as number one that's clearly supposed to represent Stalin. And this book became internationally famous as like an anti-totalitarian novel. Not quite on par with 1984, but it is very well known. I mean, I think it's even referenced in like, what's the Bob Dylan song? It's All Right, Ma, where he says, "Darkness at the break of noon, the handmade blade, the child's balloon. To understand, you know too soon," whatever, blah, blah, blah. But I think that he's alluding to that book. And actually, it's funny, Arthur Koestler, despite being a Cold Warrior, is actually kind of an interesting guy. I actually, to do research for another article I wrote, he wrote this book much later on in his life called The 13th Tribe, which was very controversial when it came out because it's one of the first books that it's a nonfiction book. It's one of the first books that puts forth the theory that Ashkenazi Jews don't descend from, the tribes of Israel. I mean, which obviously shouldn't be controversial because they've done genetic tests over and over again that show that Ashkenazi Jews descend from Europeans. But actually, this book puts forth this theory that it's controversial because basically it argues that modern Jewry descends from this ancient Turkic kingdom called, or Middle Ages Turkic kingdom called Khazaria. And there's another book by Shlomo Sand called The Invention of the Jewish People, but it's basically disputing the whole claim that Zionists have about their ancestry and whatnot. And so Arthur Koestler is kind of an interesting guy. But this book, Darkness at Noon, was a very big, popular novel that demonized the Soviet Union, much like 1984 and Animal Farm and all that. And so Arthur Koestler was one of the main literary Cold Warriors involved with the CCF as well. And, it was a covert program to fund intellectuals that were anti-Soviet. And, like I was saying, like the Cold War was not just weapons and proxy wars on the battlefront. The Cold War was also fought in the realm of ideas, or as arts and letters, as Francis Stoner Saunders puts it. And to really undermine the Soviet Union, they had to attack its ideology, which was central to its governance. And for that reason, certain artists and intellectuals and novelists, historians, philosophers, you name it, were promoted. And arts and culture became a means of spreading Western influence and countering Soviet sympathies among the intellectual elite. And the key to doing that was tapping into any anti-Stalinist or anti-communist sentiment.
I mean, what you're saying, it's interesting because I've been thinking about it, and it seems like, there was sort of this, there's the McCarthyist tactic where go after, there's the whole Red Scare, go after anyone with communist sympathies. And then I think they sort of realized this more sophisticated tactic was a more effective propaganda tool. It was better to have anti-communist material coming from a left-wing perspective. Tom Braden, who was a former CIA officer, once wrote in response to the fact that many CIA-backed artists and authors were self-professed socialists that, quote, in much of Europe in the 1950s, they, meaning the socialists, were the only people who gave a damn about fighting communism, close quote. So I think that's kind of, the strategy they were using with the literature was like this soft power strategy. Instead of suppressing the left, they were fostering the non-communist left. And CIA agent David Wissner recognized that, quote, literature
I
that
think
did
it's
not look.
Frank Wisner, right?
No, this is David Wissner. I
Did-
don't know if there's a I don't know if there's a relation.
Hmm.
But I found this when I was researching on the CIA and literature. But he said that, quote, literature that did not look like propaganda was much more effective at winning hearts and minds than polemical material, which that, you really can see that how a lot of these books that are sort of classics and that were used during the Cold War don't necessarily seem overtly political, but they are just on basic assumptions. And I learned researching for this too. Apparently, the CIA gave funds to the Iowa Writers' Workshop, which emerged in the 30s and was very influential for many subsequent creative writing programs. So they started giving money to it, and then a lot of the writers that were like the great writers came out of this. And
Hmm.
apparently the Rockefeller Foundation also contributed money to it. It's hard to find anything on it though. So I can't say too much. But back to the the novels, I mean, in terms of distributing books, the CA's covert book programs, they distributed around 10 million books and periodicals just throughout the USSR. And I mean, to get back to Orwell, whose work was really used in the Cold War, and I mean, now everyone makes references to 1984. It's so ingrained in the sort
Hmm.
of collective consciousness. But one kind of funny example is that in West Germany from 1952 to 1957, millions of copies of Animal Farm were tied to 10-foot balloons and sent out over Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Poland. The CIA-backed operation was codenamed A. It's like A dinosaur, but eight spelled AE dinosaur.
Hmm.
Uh, and so, I mean, it's just that literally they were dropping just copies of Animal Farm. So that's what's going to convince people. But the
It's the same
whole,
thing as dropping leaflets behind enemy lines. It's the same thing.
yes. And two, I mean, the CIA backed getting the cartoon made for Animal Farm too, even though it was made in Britain, it was actually funded by the CIA.
Wow.
And the British government too was involved in the sort of literary Cold War with the IRD did they also plan to distribute copies of an Animal Farm, like a drawn cartoon, and they sent various prints of that to international um, embassies, and they also promoted the translation and distribution of Animal Farm throughout other countries, specifically in the Arab world, because they thought that it would be especially effective propaganda to Muslim people because pigs and dogs are sort of like unclean animals to Muslims, and those, were the communists and Animal Farm.
Yeah, it's amazing that the perception, the general perception of communism, like the whole simplified story of like how Stalin succeeded Lenin and outmaneuvered Trotsky and this whole, I mean, it comes from a cartoon with talking animals. Like how fitting is that's the level of understanding of, I mean, and you know, I watched that they showed us Animal Farm in elementary school, I believe. I mean, it's, or middle school at least. I mean, it's very, you know, that's the level of understanding that most Americans and people in the West have of communism. That's their perception. And yeah, I mean, like Orwell, I mean, you're working on an article now about it. He was a very, and I've written about at least aspects of his background. I mean, he was a really sketchy figure. I mean, even the fact that he used a pseudonym. I mean, I know a lot of people on the left use pseudonyms for good reason, but there's something very mysterious and shadowy about his whole
I
persona. And
I personally think he used a pseudonym. He didn't, I think, his family history was so much entwined to British colonialism in India. I think he was trying to, he said George Orwell is a nice middle class name. I think he was trying to like obscure his family background by changing his last name.
yeah, you're probably right. I think that when somebody does something like that, they're definitely trying to hide something. And his political practices, I mean, what you were saying, making us a snitch list, you know, to turn into the British Foreign Office, working with Robert Conquest and all these cold warriors. I mean, and then also purporting to be on the left. And even just the way that what he's come to symbolize. I mean, he is, the fact that he's equally admired on like the pseudo left and the libertarian right. I mean, who is he? He means many different things to different people. There's not really a lot of substance there. It's just very vague
He
and general,
he
you know.
he himself is like 2 + 2 is 5.
Yeah,
Like Orwell himself is Orwellian. It's weird like having to read about him. It's yeah, he had this quote where I can't remember if I think it was in reference to World War II, but he was saying like if you cooperate with an capitalist imperialist government, you're just letting fascism in the back door. But then what does he do? He goes on to literally like work for the British government on multiple occasions. So it became, reading about his personal history, it became very apparent that he was only opposed to working with the British government if there was any kind of alliance with the Soviet Union. It seemed like he seemed to think that almost the Soviet Union was worse than Nazi Germany. So,
yeah, it's pretty shocking. And yeah, there's a number of stories about him, you know, and speaking of, I mean, the other book that he wrote that besides 1984, An Animal Farm, that was very damaging, you know, you know, the Spanish Civil War, the book that most people in English speaking world consult in regard to that is Homage to Catalonia. And that book very much demonizes the Popular Front and portrays you know, the POUM and the CNT anarchists as you know, the real revolutionaries in that war. And he himself even acknowledged that they undermined the Popular Front and that paved the way for Franco's victory. I mean, and
and I read too that, he went to Spain not having like a really good knowledge of the political situation there, and he didn't even speak very much Spanish. So it's like then this is what we take as like the story on the Spanish Civil War, and it's
well,
it's it's sort of like with the Gulag Archipelago, which is like not an exhaustive history examining a bunch of documents. I mean, originally Solzhenitsyn intended it to be a camp folklore collection written by a bunch of different people as sort of this like, well, basically, yeah, camp folklore. That's what he wanted. And
he's certainly not a historian. I
oh,
mean, he was not a serious historian. I mean, it's funny with Orwell. I mean, one of
I
the
mean,
people that he clashed with during the Spanish Civil War that was affiliated with, you know, the Communist Party was Britain was Claude Coburn, who went by the pseudonym Frank Pitcairn, who he talk shit about in Homage to Catalunya. So his, of course, Claude Coburn, all his sons, Patrick, Andrew, and Alexander Coburn, all went on to become very successful journalists, left-wing journalists. And it's Patrick or Andrew Coburn's daughter is the actress Olivia Wilde, which is a very small world. But anyway, so when the Orwell list came out in the 90s, Claude Coburn hated Orwell. And Alex Coburn was like thrilled when that list came out because it was like, this was what my father had been saying about him for decades. And now it's like, yeah, he was a fucking reactionary snitch who put together a blacklist of leftists for the British government and the Foreign Office. I mean, so yeah.
Yeah, I know. I mean, even people say that Orwell was a Trotskyist. He wasn't a Trotskyist. I don't think he considered himself a Trotskyist. And actually, the Trotskyist historian Isaac Deutscher was on Orwell's list, as well as Paul Robeson and Charlie Chaplin, to name a few.
Yeah. And what you were saying about Tom Braden earlier, I mean, if you read Francis Stoner Saunders' book, I mean, after all this stuff came out in the 60s about like Partisan Review and all these literary magazines getting funded by the CIA covertly, like Hannah Arendt and Bertrand Russell. I don't know if Bertrand Russell was on this specific article that came out, but basically everyone involved with the CCF, a lot of people tried to distance themselves after they left and said, "Oh, we didn't know that there was CIA funding." And Francis Stoner Saunders interviewed Tom Braden, and he just laughed and said, "Of course they knew." I mean, it was like it was no secret where the money was coming from. So, I mean, I'm sure there's lots of weird names that are associated with the CCF. Like one of the names that was who was at least I tried to look for information because I was so shocked. It doesn't. I suppose it's possible that a lot of people were in the dark, but one of the names that was associated was like the playwright Tennessee Williams, and I couldn't really find any evidence that he was really intimately involved. Just his name is linked to it. So I think that there were people who were kind of like in its orbit who they like tried to court, who weren't necessarily like really, they were invited to a conference, they came and spoke, and they probably didn't really have much to say one way or the other about the Cold War or whatever. Who were prominent literary people. I mean, Tennessee Williams is a brilliant playwright, obviously. But that's what they were trying to do. They never left. They considered,
From what I read, though, I think that it's very possible that Hannah Arendt was aware, though.
yeah, I mean, I think, was one of the people who Tom Braden was referring to as like, they knew. They might not want to admit it publicly, but they knew. They were happy to get the help. They didn't see it as an ethical conundrum. They didn't mind. I mean, because they were getting promoted, their work was getting promoted. They were willing to just, be used. And so, yeah, it was something that a lot of people were willing to go along with. I'm not saying all of them, but definitely a lot of them knew, and they were just embarrassed that it came out publicly.
I'd like to make just a point about Solzhenitsyn, though, that I meant to say before, but I sort of lost my train of thought, is that for the most part, he was a fiction writer. And the other history book he wrote was 200 Years Together, which was a history of Jews in Russia because, Solzhenitsyn was anti-Semitic and a fascist sympathizer. I mean, speaking of Spain, he praised Franco for Franco's Spain. He thought that it was keeping the left at bay, and not something I think people necessarily know about him, but sort of at the end of his life, he began to take a more anti-Western perspective, and then the mainstream media dropped him like a hot potato because, as you know, that's sort of how these useful figures are.
I think he probably realized later on, like a lot of sort of like Russian nationalists, even though they opposed communism, the introduction of the free market was not something good actually for Russia. And certainly like from a cultural perspective, like it meant a lot of changes in terms of social and cultural stuff, that comes with capitalism. I mean, so that's why there was a big resurgence of things like the Orthodox Church in response to it, because I mean, it was the moral and social decay that comes with free market capitalism. I think he probably had an epiphany later in life that, like people like Alexander Dugin had, that supporting being Soviet dissidents, did the introduction of capitalism was not necessarily something that they saw as any better. So even and yeah, Solzhenitsyn's case, he definitely was a notorious anti-Semite and fascist sympathizer. He was very much a Vlasovite. He sympathized with the so-called Russian Liberation Army that defected from the Red Army during World War II, and he was a reactionary through and through.
Yes, most definitely. But the whole to I think the whole discussion that we've had, and I mean, even Orwell himself acknowledged this, is that art that pretends to not be political is still political. Because, how do you separate it out from the conditions that it emerges in and influences? A lot of times it's if something doesn't seem political, it's because it's just in line with the sort of dominant ideology of the society versus what seems to be very overtly political is something that is counter to it. Michael Prenti read about this well in his book History as Mystery, where he sort of talks about how certain things are just they won't get published, they won't get attention, and then sort of the way that history is constructed by certain people, for certain purposes. It's something I don't know if people really think about. I think Rockles mentioned this, but it's an important question to ask, like who owns the means of publication? I
Mm.
mean, a lot of the book publishers now, especially, they're like almost all owned by the same few companies. And
With the monopoly that Verso Books has on the left, you know. Uh,
exactly.
what's the other one? It's like Verso and oh man, I wish I could remember. I don't know why I'm drawing a blank, but there's like, yeah, it's like a very small, like you go to the philosophy section or whatever, like it's a very, there's a real monopoly on like even like the theory canon. Like it's all like cultural study or I'm sorry, not cultural study, critical theory. It's like all put out by the same, few publishing companies. So trying to think of who I was Haymarket Books was the other one I was thinking. But it's like it's very, very few. And that go figure, it shapes the way the left is. And I think yeah, people kind of take this stuff for granted and don't really think about it.
Yeah, it reminds me of how Husserl refused, even though they published others of Domenico Lacerda's work, they refused to publish his book about Stalin.
Yeah, there's just certain subjects they're not gonna go near.
Yeah, that um one of the guys who helped to work to translate that book, he reached out to Verso and he asked, he was like, "Well, yeah, why haven't you published this book?" And instead of just being like, "No, we're not interested," he got like a really angry response of, "No, we don't want to." Something to the effect of basically, we don't want to publish that unscholarly drivel. That's not what they actually said, but to that effect. Um,
One other book we didn't mention was Dr. Zhivago.
oh, right, yes.
And I tried to read it. I'm not gonna say I finished the whole thing a long time ago. So some of it's faded from my memory. I mean, I've seen the film, the David Lean film where everyone is Russian, has British accents. Um, but it's an entertaining film. It's the guy who did he's known for big historical epics, what do you call it? Lawrence of Arabia and all that. But I think with Pasternak, like with I think, like Darkness at Noon, like I think the CIA realized it had a real opportunity to try to undermine the Soviet government, something like Dr. Zhivago, specifically by, and like Solzhenitsyn, Pasternak got the Nobel Prize in Literature, but they helped facilitate its submission to the Nobel Committee, and he subsequently did get the 1958 prize. And of course, like in Dr. Zhivago's case, it was a rejection of, because the whole thing with like abstract expressionism and the CCF, that was seen, it was weaponized because it was in contrast to the socialist realism of the Soviet Union, which is seen as very rigid and conservative, that it was conforming with the state ideology and all that. So it meant to symbolize freedom of expression with something, with a Western artistic phenomenon like abstract expressionism. But it was kind of similar with a book within the Soviet Union, with a Russian writer like Pasternak, because Dr. Zhivago, not just politically, it made very kind of subtle critiques of the Soviet government and especially, the Russian Revolution, but also within its form. I mean, it was a rejection of Soviet realism. It was seen as not aligning with that because, and was censored by the government because its narrative. If you read the book, like I said, I didn't finish it, but it puts an emphasis on the individual, and it talks about the human condition and the individual, like these characters, like Yuri Zhivago is a doctor and also a poet. He's trying to preserve his individuality up against the state and the collective, and so so while the CCF was waging an ideological battle within Europe and the West, trying to shape the Western left into becoming compatible and anti-communist, the CIA, with things like Dr. Zhivago, was behind the Iron Curtain, trying to win over those living under communism by smuggling works, like you were talking about, airdropping books critiquing the Soviet government. The Dr. Zhivago's case, it wasn't just the fact that it was politically critiquing the Soviet government, it was also in its form, not just its content, diverting from like what was expected of Soviet literature. And like, and if you've read the book, there's this narrative where there's a conflict between the individual and the state. And if you're not familiar with the story, there's Dr. Zhivago, he's the protagonist and the central character. His personal aspirations and integrity are constantly clashing with the demands of the collective as symbolized by the state. The narrative is that the Soviet government is trying to erase individuality. Also that like individuality gets lost in the act of violent revolution. The book is very critical of the violence of the revolution as being dehumanizing, even though most of the violence, of course, in reality came from the Civil War, not from the revolution. And also like his character, he's not just a doctor, he's also a poet. So like that becomes his means of individual expression and personal freedom and a form of resistance against the dominance of the historical events that, it's an epic. It takes place across several periods in Russian history. And so Boris Pasternak, he drew attention to the individual characters, like their personal journeys and the decisions they make against the backdrop of the big events like the First World War and the Russian Revolution. And the novel, these characters, these individual characters are caught in the midst of these big, societal and political upheaval. And it's very critical. The Russian Revolution it talks about the human toll, the violence, and the repression of personal identity in, the Russian Revolution's pursuit of like collective ideals and the greater good. And the book basically is very reactionary. It implies that real progress can't be made when there's, when it's coming to the detriment of individual humanity and the human spirit and all that. And those themes are, probably, it's what led to it getting censored in the Soviet Union. And then I think that the Soviets, to be fair, a lot of the decisions they made as far as like artistic censorship, and I mean hindsight's 2020, but I think in the case of film and literature and stuff, they probably did go way too far in their. I think that they gave some stuff. I mean, it's easy for me to say, but like I think that they gave certain things like a power that they might not would have had. But again, the country, there's real efforts to sabotage their government and so there was paranoia, and they overcompensated, and they you know tried to stamp out things that were too critical of the state, and it gave it an appeal and a lure that. And so Dr. Zhivago was like one of the big, iconic books that did that. I mean, there were others like, I guess, like Master and Margarita, but though I think that's a much better. Bulgakov's a much better writer than Pasternak. But
Yeah, and I think like it was kind of a culture shock for a lot of people that they had been, reading these books that the samizdat, those sort of promoted by the West, for them like what they thought was going to be like when the Soviet Union collapsed with capitalism. It was going to be like, oh, freedom of expression and all these things, and it was not how people were. It wasn't like how they'd been told it was going to be, and it was a shock. And I think sort of gave people, I mean, there's the whole phenomenon of like Soviet nostalgia, because
mhm.
it gave this shock of that, like, no, you're just like working all the time, struggling to get by, and it's not, quickly people now you have the super rich and the super poor, and it's not at all how it's
Oligarchs.
that's painted.
Yeah, I mean, whether or not there should have been, more individual freedom and all that, versus the reality that came with, you know, collapse of communism and the way that it was reintroduced. I mean, it was a total disaster. And, these propaganda campaigns and this literary Cold War, it led to that. I mean, it really facilitated all those changes.
I think, yeah, and I think it's become conflated now, like the censorship and these other things with communism, that's not why. It's like it wasn't because of that. You even see that with other countries and governments that come under the, sort of radar of being enemies of Western imperialism. They're gonna then have that because the CIA and Western imperialism is constantly trying to, like, you know, if constantly trying to destroy and regime change in certain countries. That's what creates that dynamic, is the Western imperialism. Like, it's not because, do you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, well, Michael Parenti there's a great clip of him talking about that. And he always gives the example of the Sandinistas, like when they came to power in Nicaragua, they were very naive about, they overthrew the Somoza dictatorship, who of course was backed by the United States. And they very quickly realized, like when the US started sponsoring the Contras and various uh, methods of sabotage, they needed to develop an internal security service. This is not something that they necessarily wanted to have. They were Christian socialists that just wanted to redistribute wealth and land, and have economic independence and not be subjugated by the West. And they realized they had to have secret police because there were forces trying to destroy their government and committing terrorism and all the rest of it. And so it became a necessary evil to have a secret police, and they had to start surveilling their population and trying to weed out, reactionary forces that were trying to destroy them. And did it create an environment where there was some repression and, you know, what you would call it. I mean, even though they were democratically elected and still are to this day, you know, a repressive authoritarianism, you know, yeah, like that's going to happen. That happens with every country that's targeted for regime change, no matter what their politics are, whether they're Arab nationalist countries, or communist states, or Christian socialist countries like Nicaragua. If you don't
I
play
mean,
ball with the U.S. or Western imperialism, you're going to be targeted.
well, look at how
You have to
Russia's
report to that.
like Russia and Putin are treated, and like Russia's capitalist. So it's like
Yeah.
that's why the one of the main problems with the Western left, I think, is this fixation on authoritarianism abroad instead of like addressing US imperialism and intervention. Just reading that book about the CIA's inventions, just like interventions, just country after country after country after country after country. And the leaders that thought they were gonna like play nice with Western, with, like they want to play nice, but they don't want to go along with Western imperialism, they get knocked off so
Yeah,
fast.
all of them. Mossadegh, uh, uh, Arbenz, Trujillo, all Allende. None of those people were communists. They were all social democratic. They were critical of. I mean, Mossadegh was hated by the what is it, the Tudeh party in Iran. I mean, they were. He was not a communist. Even what's his name in the Congo?
Lumumba?
Yeah, Lumumba, Patrice Lumumba. He was not a communist. I mean, and so that's what happened. So yeah, like, can you really blame Castro for like not having elections? You know, like,
I
sorry, he's
I
not
have to add,
stupid.
I think it's totally awesome that like the CIA tried to assassinate him 600 times and failed.
Probably more than that. I mean, they were trying to
Well,
put poison on his cigar, and
I think they had one where they wanted to do exploding an exploding cigar.
yeah, maybe that's what it was. I mean, they tried everything, and there's even a story about him where like there was supposed to be a guy that assassinated him at some place, and he showed up there beforehand, said, "Hey, I'm here," and the person was like, "What the hell? Like, he's not supposed to be here already." Like, that's how sophisticated like the Cuban intelligence agency, because it was trained by the KGB, that I mean, they would not let anything. They could not kill Castro. Like, it was like he was so well protected. But But yeah, no, this has gonna been a great discussion. That whole tangent about Dr. Zhivago, I didn't want to forget, but um, uh, yeah, I mean, I think people need to be aware of this stuff. You know, the Congress for Cultural Freedom. We could probably do an episode about each aspect, you know, of culture that it had a hand in. And literature was one of the primary. And it wasn't just the CCF; it was also stuff like the Information Research Department, which we mentioned, in Britain, and also this stuff they did with things like uh, Dr. Zhivago, you know, fomenting dissent behind the Iron Curtain, trying to get the populations there to turn against the communist governments. It was a multifaceted Cold War being fought on many different cultural fronts.
Yes. No, exactly. And I mean, the whole thing with the art, I think I mentioned this before, but I kind of on a, it just, it's kind of funny. I just feel kind of personally vindicated because I've never really much cared for abstract expressionism.
Well, you know, it's said that, I mean, I think a lot of people, I mean, it's kind of a joke at this point that, like, I mean, you have to wonder, like, because the critics in these journals that were giving this stuff like rave reviews, like Clement Greenberg, who was even providing like the theoretical, like formalist justification for, you know, this new art movement, would it have been as successful, especially market wise? Like, would, because most people, like, when they go and look at it, like, they think it's crap, but yet it's, you know, wildly popular. I mean, people can debate its artistic merit. I don't think that, like, as a whole, like, I mean, there's Arshil Gorky, I think, is all right. But some people really like Rothko. I don't, I mean, and Pollock, I mean, there's some of it's okay, but is it like, was it really that good? Like to where it was like museum level, like, especially like other stuff in the period that was, you have to wonder about its success. How much of it was engineered culturally by the covert funding and the fact that these people who gave it rave reviews in elite cultural elite magazines, they were on the payroll of the CIA, and look at the trajectory of the art world. I mean, how, what came after abstract expressionism with like pop art, and the way that the art market is just, the art world is just totally sold out, and it's just a fucking money laundering scheme now, with conceptual contemporary art, and it's just become a self-parody almost. You know,
Yeah,
you have
it
to
really
wonder. So,
it really has. I read a recently published book about artists who are like somehow channeling Leonora Carrington, and I thought the book would be more about Leonora Carrington because, her art was really quite good in my opinion. But no, it was about these artists that were using Leonora Carrington as their medium. It was a very postmodern thesis, but it was talking about this one artist, I can't remember her name, who was doing paintings with menstrual blood using her partner's dick as a brush. And it's just like, oh my God, this is where we're at with
um,
art.
that sounds just like kind of a ripoff of Serrano, Andres Serrano, and like the Piss Christ thing. I remember he did those photographs of semen that Metallica used on one of their covers that was like really controversial. Anyway, I want to remind people to, if you're on Substack or YouTube, please hit like, leave comments. Don't forget to hit subscribe. If you're on YouTube, we have a Substack page. It's shanabatterson.substack.com. Our YouTube channel is Captive Minds Pod. We have an X account. If you want to follow us, it's Captive Minds X. But we'll be back for another episode either next week or the following. But thank you for tuning in to Captive Minds. Shana, do you have any final thoughts?
Um, no, I don't. Well, thank you for listening.
Yes, thank you. Take care.